I had been working as a teacher for only 2 weeks when I saw the principal humiliate a poor student because of his old clothes. I intervened, and the principal just said, "If you're so smart, let's see how long you last here." 3 days later, I was fired. He thought that was the end, not realizing that everything he did was captured on camera. So there I was, 24 years old, fresh out of college with my shiny new teaching degree and absolutely zero idea what I was getting myself into. You know how it is when you're young and idealistic. You think you're going to change the world, one classroom at a time. Well, let me tell you, Lincoln Middle School wasn't exactly the inspirational movie setting I had in mind. The place looked like it hadn't seen a renovation since the Carter administration. Peeling paint, flickering fluorescent lights, and that weird smell that every old school has. You know the one, like disinfectant mixed with disinfectant and decades of teenage angst. But hey, I was determined to make the best of it. After all, this was my shot at making a difference. My first week went smoothly enough. The kids were typical middle schoolers, some eager to learn, others convinced that algebra was a government conspiracy designed to torture them. I was starting to find my rhythm, figuring out which students needed extra attention and which ones just needed someone to believe in them. Then came that Tuesday morning that changed everything. I was heading to the main office to grab some copies when I heard Ray's voices coming from around the corner. Now, in a middle school, Ray's voices aren't exactly unusual, but something about this felt different. The tone was harsh, aggressive, and definitely not coming from a student. As I rounded the corner, I saw Principal Henderson towering over the scrawny 8th grader named Marcus. The kid was maybe 5 feet tall, soaking wet, with clothes that had seen better days, probably better decades. His sneakers were held together with duct tape, and his backpack looked like it had survived multiple wars. Marcus was just standing there, shoulders hunched, staring at his feet, while Henderson went off on him. Henderson was laying into this kid about his appearance, making comments about how his ratty clothes were bringing down the school's image. He was going on about standards and respect, but the way he was saying it, man, it made my stomach turn. The kid wasn't talking back, wasn't being disrespectful, just standing there taking it like he'd heard it all before. That's when something inside me snapped. Maybe it was because I remembered being that awkward kid once, or maybe it was because I actually gave a damn about these students. Either way, I couldn't just walk away and pretend I hadn't seen anything. I stepped forward and cleared my throat loud enough to get Henderson's attention. The principal turned around, clearly annoyed at being interrupted mid-rant. I looked him straight in the eye and told him that what he was doing was completely unacceptable. A principal shouldn't be humiliating a student over something as trivial as clothing, especially when it was obvious the family was struggling financially. The hallway went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Marcus looked up at me with these wide eyes, probably shocked that someone was actually standing up for him. Henderson's face went from annoyed to absolutely furious in about 2 seconds flat. He stepped closer to me, invading my personal space in that aggressive way some people do when they're trying to intimidate you. His voice dropped to this cold, threatening whisper as he told me that if I thought I was so smart, we'd see exactly how long I'd lasted at school. At the time, I thought it was just empty posturing. You know, the kind of thing bullies say when they get called out. I figured he'd cool off, maybe even realize he was in the wrong. Looking back now, I can see that was the moment my fate at Lincoln Middle School was sealed. But in that moment, watching Marcus straighten up just a little bit, seeing a spark of hope in his eyes that someone had his back, I knew I'd done the right thing, even if it meant making an enemy of the principal on my second week on the job. I had no idea that those few words would completely derail my career and send my life spiraling in a direction I never could have imagined. Sometimes standing up for what's right comes with a price you never saw coming. Henderson dismissed Marcus with a wave of his hand, but kept staring at me with this look that promised trouble. As I watched that kid walk away with his head held just a tiny bit higher, I thought I'd won a small victory. What I didn't realize was that I'd just declared war on someone who played by completely different rules than I did. 3 days. That's all it took for Henderson to make his move. I should have seen it coming, but honestly, I was still living in this naive bubble where I thought professionalism and basic human decency meant something in the education system. Boy, was I wrong about that. It started small, like these things always do. Suddenly, my lesson plans needed extra approval. My classroom supplies mysteriously went missing. The copy machine was always broken when I needed it, but somehow worked fine for everyone else. Classic power play stuff that you'd expect from a petty middle manager, not someone supposedly dedicated to education. Then came the parent complaints. Apparently, according to Henderson, several parents had called to express concerns about my teaching methods. Funny thing was, every parent I'd actually spoken to seemed pretty happy with how their kids were doing in my class. But when you're the new guy going up against someone who's been there for 15 years, who do you think the district's going to believe? I tried talking to other teachers about what was happening, but most of them just gave me these uncomfortable looks and changed the subject. Can't say I blame them. They had mortgages to pay and families to feed. Going up against the principal wasn't exactly a career-enhancing move, and everybody knew it. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon. I was grading papers in my classroom when Henderson's secretary knocked on my door. She looked genuinely sorry as she handed me the official notice to report to the principal's office first thing Monday morning. The way she couldn't make eye contact told me everything I needed to know. That weekend was torture. I kept going over everything in my head, trying to figure out if there was some way I could have handled the Marcus situation differently. Maybe I could have pulled Henderson aside privately instead of calling him out in the hallway. Maybe I should have just minded my own business and walked away like everyone else probably would have. Monday morning arrived way too fast. I walked into Henderson's office expecting some kind of disciplinary meeting, maybe a formal reprimand to go in my file. What I got instead was a termination letter sitting on his desk like a loaded weapon. Henderson didn't even try to hide his satisfaction as he slid the paper across to me. The official reason was listed as insubordination and failure to follow proper administrative protocols. Reading those words felt like getting punched in the gut by someone wearing brass knuckles. He leaned back in his chair with a smug expression and explained how my outburst in the hallway had violated several school policies. Apparently, questioning administrative decisions in front of students was grounds for immediate dismissal. Who knew that standing up for a kid being bullied by an adult was considered a fireable offense? The whole thing was clearly orchestrated. Henderson had been planning this from the moment I opened my mouth 3 days earlier. He'd probably spent the weekend crafting the perfect paper trail to make sure his decision would stick. This wasn't some heat-of-the-moment reaction. This was calculated revenge. As I sat there staring at that termination letter, Henderson kept talking about how disruptive influences couldn't be tolerated in his school. He mentioned something about maintaining order and respect for authority. But all I could think about was Marcus and how this man was supposed to be protecting kids, not tearing them down. The worst part wasn't losing the job, though that definitely stung, especially with my student loans breathing down my neck like hungry wolves. The worst part was knowing that Henderson had won, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. He'd successfully eliminated the one person who dared to challenge his authority, and now he could go back to running his little kingdom however he wanted. I cleaned out my desk that afternoon, while the halls were empty, packing up those teaching supplies I bought with my own money, taking down the motivational posters I'd hung up to make the room more welcoming. It felt like dismantling a dream I'd barely gotten started. Walking out of Lincoln Middle School for the last time, I passed by Marcus in the hallway. The kid looked at me with this mixture of confusion and guilt, like somehow my firing was his fault. I wanted to tell him it wasn't, that standing up for what's right is always worth it, but Henderson was watching from his office window like a hawk. As I drove home with my boxes of teaching materials in the back seat, I kept thinking about how unfair the whole situation was. Here I was, getting punished for doing exactly what every education course had taught me, advocating for my students. Meanwhile, Henderson got to keep his position and continue his reign of petty tyranny. That night, sitting in my apartment surrounded by the remnants of my teaching career, I made myself a promise. This wasn't over. Henderson might have won this battle, but I wasn't going down without a fight. I just had to figure out how to take on someone who held all the cards and had the entire system backing him up. Little did I know that the answer was hiding in plain sight, just waiting for me to be smart enough to find it. 2 weeks into my unexpected unemployment, I was starting to lose my mind. You know that feeling when you're so angry about an injustice that you can't think about anything else? That was me, pacing around my apartment like a caged animal, replaying that hallway confrontation over and over in my head. I'd already started applying to other schools, but let me tell you, having a termination on your record doesn't exactly make you the most attractive candidate. Every interview felt like an interrogation, with principals wanting to know why I'd only lasted 3 weeks at my previous position. Try explaining that story without sounding like a troublemaker. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source, my old college buddy Jake, who worked as an IT consultant for the school district. We met up for beers one night, and I was doing my usual rant about Henderson when Jake suddenly got this weird look on his face. Turns out Jake had been at Lincoln just 2 days before my firing, doing some routine maintenance on their security system. He remembered seeing me in the hallway that Tuesday morning, but more importantly, he remembered exactly where the incident with Marcus had taken place, right underneath one of the main corridor cameras. Now, Jake couldn't just hand over security footage. That would have gotten him fired faster than you could say a lawsuit. But he could tell me about the school's video retention policy and maybe mention which tech guy at Lincoln was getting pretty fed up with Henderson's management style. That tech guy turned out to be Dave Morrison, a 40-something former Navy guy who'd been running the school's IT department for about 5 years. Jake described him as someone who didn't suffer fools gladly and had zero patience for administrative BS. Perfect. I spent 3 days working up the courage to approach Dave. Finally, I caught him after school hours in the parking lot, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. When I introduced myself as a teacher who'd been fired, his expression immediately shifted from annoyed to interested. Dave had heard about what happened through the teacher grapevine, and apparently, my situation wasn't exactly unique. Henderson had a pattern of getting rid of staff who questioned his methods, and Dave had been documenting some pretty questionable behavior for months. He'd been waiting for someone with enough motivation to actually do something about it. The security footage from that Tuesday morning was crystal clear. There I was, walking down the hallway, hearing the commotion, and witnessing Henderson absolutely tearing into Marcus. You could see the exact moment I decided to intervene, and Henderson's aggressive response when I called him out. But here's where it gets interesting. Dave had pulled footage from several other incidents over the past year. Henderson screaming at a janitor for leaving a smudge on a window. Henderson cornering a young female teacher and making inappropriate comments about her clothing. Henderson publicly humiliating a student with learning disabilities for struggling to read aloud. Watching those videos felt like having a front row seat to a masterclass in workplace bullying. This wasn't just about me or Marcus. This was a systematic pattern of abuse that Henderson had been getting away with because nobody had the evidence to stop him. Dave explained that he'd been keeping these recordings as insurance, knowing that eventually Henderson would cross a line that couldn't be ignored. My firing had apparently been that line. He was tired of watching good people get destroyed while Henderson played dictator. The plan was simple but risky. Dave would make copies of the relevant footage and provide documentation of Henderson's pattern of behavior. I would file a formal complaint with the state education department and the district's human resources division. Between the video evidence and witness statements, we might actually have a shot at exposing what was really happening at Lincoln Middle School. Of course, if we failed, Dave would definitely lose his job, and I'd probably be blacklisted from ever teaching again. But sometimes you reach a point where doing nothing feels worse than taking a massive risk. This was one of those moments. Sitting in Dave's basement office, watching him burn those files onto a disk, I felt something I hadn't experienced since that Tuesday morning. Hope. Real, honest-to-God hope that maybe justice wasn't just some abstract concept they taught in civics class. Dave handed me the disc and looked me straight in the eye. He told me that a lot of good teachers had been destroyed by Henderson's ego, and a lot of kids had suffered because people were too scared to speak up. This was my chance to break that cycle. As I drove home with that evidence burning a hole in my pocket, I realized I was about to find out whether the system actually protected people like me and Marcus, or whether it just protected people like Henderson. Either way, I was all in. The war Henderson thought he'd won was just getting started, and now I had ammunition. Filing the complaint felt like jumping off a cliff with no guarantee there was water at the bottom. I spent 3 days crafting the perfect letter to the State Department of Education, laying out every detail of Henderson's behavior and attaching copies of Dave's video evidence. My hands were literally shaking when I hit send on that email. The first response was typical bureaucratic nonsense, a form letter thanking me for my concern and promising a thorough investigation within 60 business days. 60 days. Meanwhile, Henderson was probably terrorizing more kids and destroying more careers while some pencil pusher took their sweet time reviewing my case. But then something unexpected happened. Dr. Patricia Williams from the district's HR department called me personally within a week. Apparently, my complaint wasn't the only one they received about Henderson recently. 3 other former teachers had filed similar reports over the past 6 months, and now they had to take it seriously. The district moved faster than I'd ever seen a government organization move. Within 2 weeks, they had launched a formal investigation and brought in an independent investigator from outside the district. Henderson was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome, which sent shockwaves through the entire school system. That's when things got really ugly. Henderson wasn't going down without a fight, and he had connections throughout the district that I didn't even know existed. Suddenly, my character was being attacked from every angle. Anonymous sources were telling investigators that I was unstable, that I had anger management issues, that I'd been inappropriate with female staff members. The stress was unbelievable. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, wondering if I'd made a huge mistake, if maybe I should have just taken my firing and moved on with my life. My savings account was drying up, job prospects were looking grim, and every day felt like waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then came the hearing. Picture a sterile conference room with fluorescent lights that made everyone look like they were dying, filled with suits who looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else. Henderson showed up with his lawyer and a stack of character witnesses thick enough to stop a bullet. His defense was predictably pathetic. He claimed the videos were taken out of context, that his interactions with students were part of legitimate disciplinary procedures, and that I was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge for my justified termination. His lawyer painted me as an unstable troublemaker who couldn't handle authority. But then it was my turn to present evidence. Dave had done his homework. The video compilation he put together was devastating. You could see Henderson's pattern of behavior clear as day, incident after incident of him abusing his power and targeting vulnerable people. The investigator asked Henderson to explain his actions in the Marcus incident. Watching him try to justify humiliating a kid over his clothes was like watching someone try to defend kicking a puppy. He kept falling back on school policy and maintaining standards, but it was obvious to everyone in the room that he'd crossed a line. Marcus's mother had agreed to testify, and her statement was heart-wrenching. She talked about how her son had come home crying that day, how he'd begged her not to send him back to school, how he'd started having nightmares about being embarrassed in front of his classmates again. But the real game changer was when other staff members started coming forward. Once Henderson was suspended and couldn't retaliate, people found their courage. Teachers, janitors, cafeteria workers, they all had stories about his behavior. The man had been running Lincoln Middle School like his personal fiefdom for years. Henderson's lawyer tried one last desperate play, claiming that the investigation was biased and that his client was being railroaded by a conspiracy of disgruntled employees. He demanded that all video evidence be thrown out because it was obtained without proper authorization. That's when Dave stepped up and calmly explained that as the IT director, he had full authority to access security footage for legitimate purposes. Documenting potential administrative misconduct definitely qualified. Henderson's lawyer looked like he'd been punched in the face. The hearing wrapped up with closing statements, and I have to admit, I was terrified. Henderson's legal team had done everything they could to discredit me and the evidence, and bureaucratic systems don't exactly have a reputation for protecting the little guy. Walking out of that conference room, I felt completely drained. Months of stress, unemployment, and uncertainty had taken their toll. Dave patted me on the shoulder and reminded me that regardless of the outcome, we'd done the right thing. Kids like Marcus deserved better than Henderson's brand of leadership. The waiting period was torture. Every day felt like a year, checking my email constantly for any update from the investigation committee. I put everything on the line for this complaint, and now all I could do was wait and hope that justice actually meant something. 3 weeks later, the phone finally rang, and everything changed. Dr. Williams's voice on the phone sounded different this time, warmer, more human. She asked if I could come in to discuss the investigation results, and something in her tone made me think this wasn't going to be another bureaucratic runaround. For the first time in months, I felt a tiny spark of hope. Walking into the district office, I was surprised to see Dave waiting in the lobby. Turns out they called him in too, probably to thank him for his cooperation, or maybe to discipline him for his role in exposing Henderson. Either way, having him there made me feel less alone in this whole mess. The meeting room was packed with people I didn't recognize, district officials, legal representatives, and a woman I later learned was the new interim principal for Lincoln Middle School. Dr. Williams started by thanking us for our courage in coming forward, which immediately told me we'd won. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of misconduct spanning Henderson's entire tenure as principal. Beyond the incidents Dave had documented, they'd found evidence of financial irregularities, inappropriate relationships with vendors, and a hostile work environment that had driven away dozens of quality teachers over the years. Henderson had been terminated effective immediately, with no possibility of reinstatement. His teaching license was under review by the state, and there were hints that criminal charges might be filed for some of his more egregious violations. The man who thought he was untouchable had finally met his match. But here's where the story gets really good. They offered me Henderson's job, not permanently, mind you, but as interim principal while they conducted a proper search. The irony was delicious. The teacher he'd fired for standing up to bullying was being asked to clean up the mess he'd left behind. My first day back at Lincoln was surreal. Walking through those same hallways where Henderson had humiliated Marcus, sitting behind the desk where he'd handed me my termination letter, it felt like some kind of cosmic justice was finally being served. The staff response was incredible. Teachers who'd been terrified to speak up before were suddenly enthusiastic about implementing new programs and policies. The whole atmosphere of the school shifted from fear-based compliance to actual educational collaboration. It was like watching a prison transform into a real learning environment. Marcus was one of the first students to visit my office, not because he was in trouble, but because he wanted to thank me. This kid who'd been crushed under Henderson's boot was now standing tall, participating in class discussions, even running for student council. Seeing that transformation made every sleepless night and moment of uncertainty worth it. Dave got promoted to district IT director, finally getting the recognition he deserved for years of quietly doing the right thing. We still grab beers occasionally and laugh about how a couple of nobodies managed to take down someone who seemed invincible. The district offered me the permanent principal position after 6 months, but I turned it down. Don't get me wrong, I loved the work, but my heart was still in the classroom. I took a teaching position at a different school in the district, one where I could focus on what I'd always wanted to do, actually educate kids. Henderson disappeared from the education world entirely. Last I heard, he was working in insurance sales somewhere in Florida, probably terrorizing customers instead of students and teachers. Some people never learn, but at least he couldn't hurt any more kids in positions of authority. Looking back on the whole experience, I realize it taught me something valuable about standing up for what's right. Sometimes the system works, but only when good people are willing to take risks to make it work. If I just walked away that day in the hallway, Henderson would still be destroying lives and crushing spirits. Every time I see a teacher advocate for a student, or a student find the courage to speak up against unfairness, I think about that moment with Marcus. One small act of defiance changed everything. Not just for me, but for an entire school community that had been living under Henderson's toxic leadership. The best part? Marcus graduated as valedictorian 3 years later and got a full scholarship to State University. During his graduation speech, he talked about the importance of having adults who believe in you and fight for you. He didn't mention me by name, but the look he gave me from the podium said everything. Sometimes standing up to bullies costs you everything. But sometimes, if you're really lucky and you have people like Dave backing you up, it leads to something better than you ever imagined. Henderson thought he destroyed my career, but he actually gave me the chance to discover what I was really capable of. That kid who got humiliated in a hallway ended up changing all our lives, just by being brave enough to let someone fight for him. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to my crazy story. I know it sounds like something out of a movie, but sometimes real life is stranger than fiction. What do you think? Have you ever had to stand up to someone in power who was abusing their position? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Your support means everything and helps me keep sharing these real-life experiences. Until next time, keep fighting the good fight